A person can abandon being themselves for so long that they eventually mistake what they are not for who they are. This is not an illusion. This is the price the psyche pays to survive. I want you to sit with that for a moment before we go any further. Because what I am about to describe is not unusual. It is not a condition that belongs to fragile or damaged people. It is one of the most common things I saw across 40 years of practice in the most ordinary, capable, apparently well-functioning individuals who sat across from me in that chair. They had learned to be someone else, and they had learned it so thoroughly that they no longer remembered the learning. The constructed self had become the only self they recognized. In my work, I call this persona identification. The persona is the mask we wear for the world. It is a necessary thing. We all need it. The trouble begins when a person no longer knows where the mask ends and the face begins. When the role they learn to play in order to be acceptable, safe, or loved becomes the only identity they can access. And here is what I kept noticing. This did not happen through dramatic cruelty. It happened through something far quieter. Through the slow, patient, often well-intentioned work of the people closest to them. Stay with me, because the next part changes the meaning of everything I have just described. The version of you that someone else created did not arrive all at once. It was assembled gradually across years through accumulation of small corrections. You were too loud, you were too sensitive, you think too much, you are being dramatic, you always do this, you never understand. Each of these is a small instruction, a small redirection away from your own experience and toward a version that someone else found more manageable. If the instructions came from someone you loved and needed, you did not experience them as instructions. You experienced them as truth. Because the mind of a person who loves and depends on another cannot easily hold the thought that this person might be wrong about me. It is too costly. So instead it does something more economical. It accepts the instruction. It adjusts. It files away the original perception and replaces it with the corrected version. This happens in families most often. But I have seen it in long marriages, in close friendships, in certain workplaces, where one person's authority was so complete that the people around them slowly reorganized their sense of themselves around that authority. The setting changes. The mechanism is always the same. If you have found yourself wondering at some point in your life whether you actually know what you want, whether you actually know what you think, whether the preferences and opinions you hold are genuinely yours, or whether you received them from somewhere else and forgot to notice, then what I am describing is not abstract to you. If the question has ever arrived, even briefly, who would I be if I had not been shaped by that person, that family, that marriage, that room, then you are already closer to the work I want to describe than you might realize. If you find this kind of question worth sitting with, I would be glad if you subscribe to this channel, because what follows is the part that most people never reach. Let me tell you about a patient I will call Martha. She came to me in her mid-60s. She had raised children, managed a household, supported a husband's career for decades, and was by all external measures a person of considerable competence and warmth. She came because her husband had died the previous year, and she found herself unable to make the simplest decisions about her own life, what to do with her mornings, whether to travel, what to eat. She described it as feeling like a compass that had lost its north. When I asked her what she had wanted before the marriage, she became very still. Then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "I am not sure I ever knew. He always seemed so certain about everything, including about me, that it felt easier to agree. And then one day I looked up, and 40 years had passed, and I realized I had been living someone else's answer to the question of who I was." She was not describing a bad marriage. She was describing a particular kind of disappearance. Slow, consensual, almost invisible while it was happening. This is what I mean when I say the price the psyche pays to survive. Martha had not lost herself through some failure of character. She had done something intelligent and ultimately costly. She had traded the difficulty of being uncertain and autonomous for the relative safety of being known and contained within someone else's certainty. It worked in the way that such arrangements always work, until the arrangement ended. And then she found herself alone with a self she had not visited in 40 years. But here is what most people miss entirely. The self she had not visited was still there. This is the thing I want to be very clear about, because it is the thing that makes this conversation worth having. The original self does not dissolve. It does not disappear. It goes underground. It waits. It expresses itself through symptoms, through inexplicable dissatisfaction, through the recurring sense that something is missing that you cannot name, through dreams, through the sudden and apparently irrational grief that ambushes you at odd moments when life appears to be going well. These are not signs of pathology. They are signs of a self that has not given up on being found. I have seen this again and again across my clinical years. The person who has been living someone else's version of them for a long time does not need to build a new self. They need to excavate the original one. And that distinction matters enormously, because building implies starting from nothing, which is both false and unnecessarily frightening. Excavating implies that what you are looking for is already there under layers of accumulated instruction, and that the work is one of careful, patient uncovering. What does the uncovering look like? It begins with something uncomfortable, with noticing the gap between what you say and what you feel, between the version of yourself you perform for others and the version you recognize when no one is watching. Most people who have been living someone else's construction of them have become very skilled at this performance, so skilled that they barely notice the gap anymore. The first task is simply to begin noticing it again, not judging it, not trying to close it immediately, just noticing that it exists. I used to ask patients to try a very small thing. When you form an opinion, before you share it, write it down exactly as it first arrived, not the polished version, not the version adjusted for how you imagine it will be received, the whole first version. And then, after you have shared whatever you share, read back what you first thought. Over time, comparing these two things, you begin to see the adjustments you make automatically. And seeing the adjustments is the beginning of having a choice about them. Martha found this practice almost unbearable at first. She said it was like hearing a stranger's voice coming from inside her own chest. But after several months, she began to recognize it. And then something remarkable happened. She stopped calling it a stranger's voice. She began calling it hers. Stay with me, because the next part is the one people tend to resist. There is a particular difficulty in this work that I want to name directly, because it trips people up and they do not always understand why. When you begin to reclaim an identity that was shaped largely by another person, you will almost certainly encounter grief. Not just for the time lost, not just for the choices unmade, but for the person who did the shaping. Because here is the paradox that lies at the center of this kind of recovery. The person who constructed a version of you and expected you to inhabit it in most cases was not doing so out of malice. They were doing it out of their own psychological limitations, their own anxiety, their own need for a world that was predictable and contained. They may have loved you genuinely and completely while simultaneously being unable to tolerate the full reality of who you were. These two things are not contradictory. They are simply human. And when you begin to step out of the version they created, when you begin to take up more of your own space, when you begin to trust your own perceptions and follow your own inclinations, you may find yourself grieving them even as you are freeing yourself from what they built. This is not confusion. This is the natural complexity of deep attachment. It does not mean you are wrong to step free. It means you are doing something difficult and real. I watched Martha go through this grief across nearly 2 years. She wept for her husband, whom she had loved. She wept for the version of herself that had learned to love being his certainty. She wept for the years in which she had not known to ask the question she was now asking. And gradually, through all of that, something else emerged. A woman who could eat breakfast in her own kitchen and know without consulting anyone whether she wanted tea or coffee. Who could look at a map and feel a genuine pull toward a particular place. Who could disagree with her adult children and feel the disagreement as information rather than as danger? This is what the return of the self looks like. It is not dramatic. It is not the sudden arrival of a new and transformed person. It is the quiet, incremental reclamation of ordinary moments, the preference that is actually yours, the no that comes without apology, the yes that comes without performance. I want to offer you something before I close. Not a technique exactly, more of an orientation. The next time you are about to say something about yourself, about what you want, what you think, what you feel, pause for a moment before you say it and ask yourself one question. Did I think this, or did I learn to think this? You do not need to answer the question definitively. You do not need to discard everything that might have come from elsewhere. Much of what we receive from others becomes genuinely ours over time. And that is not a problem. The question is not whether you were influenced. Everyone is influenced. The question is whether you have ever been given the space to find out which parts are authentically yours. If the answer is not clearly yes, then perhaps the most important work available to you right now is not self-improvement in the usual sense. It is something quieter and considerably more fundamental. It is finding out who you actually are beneath the version that was built for you. The self that went underground did not die. It has been patient. It is still there. What do you call that voice when you finally hear it speak without being corrected? Leave that in the comments if you are willing. I find that question tells people more about themselves than almost any other. There is a thread that runs naturally from this conversation into the territory of dreams, into what the unconscious does with the self that has been suppressed for a long time. That is a conversation worth continuing another time. I want to return to something that tends to get overlooked. We speak about reclaiming the self as though the difficulty is purely internal. But there is another obstacle worth naming plainly. When you begin to step out of the version someone else created, the people around you will often respond in ways that make the stepping out harder. Not always consciously, not always with any awareness of what they are doing. But the person who knew the old version of you had organized their relationship to you around that version. They knew what to expect. They knew how to navigate you. They knew what you would tolerate, what you would accept, what you would not question. When you begin to change, you become less predictable to them. That discomfort comes out in various ways. Sometimes as concern, you seem different lately. Are you all right? Sometimes as criticism, you have changed. I do not know you anymore. Sometimes as pressure. Why are you being so difficult? I noticed that patients who were making genuine progress often became temporarily more distressed, not because their recovery was failing, but because the people in their lives were reacting to it. They had expected the inner work to make things calmer. Instead, things became for a time more turbulent. They mistook this for evidence that something was going wrong. I had to explain again and again that the turbulence was often evidence that something was going right. A self that has been invisible for a long time, when it begins to become visible, will disturb the arrangements that depended on its invisibility. It is a passage that must be moved through. This does not mean that every relationship will survive the passage. Some will not. Some were built entirely around the suppressed version of you. And when that version is no longer available, the relationship loses its foundation. This is a real loss, and it deserves to be grieved as such. But in my experience, the relationships that matter most, the ones that are capable of genuine depth and genuine love, generally do survive. They survive because the people in them are capable of growing alongside you, even when the growth is initially uncomfortable for them. What does not survive is any relationship that was built on the condition that you remain diminished. And losing those, while painful, is often the clearing that makes room for something more real. One last thing, and I want to say it carefully. The work of reclaiming yourself from a version someone else built does not require you to condemn the people who built it. I have watched patients spend years in rage at parents, at partners, at families, and I have never seen that rage produce what it promised. It tends instead to keep the person tethered to the story of what was done to them. What they need is to become more interested in who they are now than in who was responsible for the old construction. The past built something. The past is finished. What is not finished is you. Martha, in our last session together, said something I have not forgotten. She said that she had expected recovering herself to feel like a victory. Instead, it felt like coming home to a house she had been locked out of for a long time. Everything slightly dusty, everything slightly unfamiliar, but hers, undeniably and completely hers. That is what I want for anyone who recognizes themselves in what I have described. Not triumph, not transformation into someone new, simply the quiet, unremarkable experience of being in possession of your own life again.